Good Shabbos. This week's Parsha is Parshas Yitro. And in this Parsha we have the Ten Commandments. Interestingly, when you look at the Ten Commandments, out of all of the 10, only 3 are really positive commandments. The first one might not even be a commandment. It's Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. That's questionable whether it's a commandment or a statement. Other than that, the only other ones that are positive commandments are the keeping of Shabbos and kabedus avicha v'simecha, to honor your father and your mother. So I'd like to focus on the keeping of the Shabbos, which is the one mitzvah, positive mitzvah, which is associated with our relationship with God rather than our relationship with fellow human beings. And simply when you read the 10 Commandments about Shabbos, it says very simply, you should work for 6 days and keep the 7th day as a day of rest. Why? Ki sheishes yamim asa Hashem es hashmayim saaretz. Because God made the world, the heaven and the earth, in 6 days, and the sea, is called Shabbat, and everything that's in it. And he rested on the 7th day. Al kain berach Hashem es yom HaShabbos. Therefore, God blessed the day of Shabbos, vayikadsheu, and he sanctified it, which is completely consistent with the beginning of the story of creation, where on the 7th day it says that God, that he blessed it and he sanctified it, because on that day he finished the work. So 100% consistent with the story of creation is the commandment to keep the Shabbos. Simply, as I mentioned other times, that therefore would be a mitzvah which would be specifically, not specifically to the Jewish people, but would be universal. And in this commandment, it actually says, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos, to remember the day of Shabbos, to sanctify it. And simply, the Talmud understands that commandment to remember is to say Kiddush, is to sanctify the day. Literally, that's what Kiddush is, to sanctify the day and to remember it, and that's the positive commandment of keeping Shabbos. That's really the only positive biblical commandment of keeping Shabbos. When the 10 Commandments are repeated in the book of Devarim, in Parshas Veschanan, there it starts off differently. It says, Shomer es Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho, keep the day of Shabbos, which the rabbis understood as keeping, meaning the prohibitions of the laws of Shabbos. And it says, Kasha tzivacha, there it uses the word as I commanded you. And then it goes on to say, for 6 days, again, you should work and do everything that you need to do. On the 7th day, you should rest. And it says, why? V'zacharta, you shall remember, ki eved ha'yisa be'eretz Mitzrayim, that you were a slave, or you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and God took you out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Again, it says, Al kain sivcha, therefore God commanded you, lasas Yom HaShabbos, to do the day of Shabbos, to keep the day of Shabbos. So the language of command is used in the second version of the 10 Commandments, where in the first that's left out. The first one it says to remember, this one it says to keep, which refers to the negative commandments of Shabbos. And most importantly is the reason given for Shabbos. In the first of the 10 Commandments, it says that the reason is because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And in this one, it says because we were slaves in Egypt. Now, the truth is, being slaves in Egypt doesn't seem to have anything to do with Shabbos. It's not consistent with the story as it's told in Bereshis, in Genesis. It's not consistent with the first version of the 10 Commandments. And there doesn't seem to be any logical connection between the two. And what this does is say it's specifically a Jewish concept and not a universal one, which is also a very big difference between these two versions of the 10 Commandments. So I'd like to suggest that if we start to understand a little bit about what Shabbos really means and why we keep Shabbos in the first place on the 7th day because of the day of rest, we might understand why it might be connected with Yetzias Mitzrayim, with the Exodus from Egypt. And when you think about it, if we want to commemorate the fact that God created the world in 6 days and then he rested, well, once you cease work, you're resting from here on in. The creation's finished after 6 days. There's no difference then between day 7 and day 8 and day 9. He stopped working. So there's nothing that happened on the 7th day. Yes, it's a day of rest, but so is the 8th day a day of rest, and so on and so forth. So what makes the 7th day specific, and why should we celebrate it as specifically a day of rest? So one way to understand this is that on the 7th day, we don't only want to show that God stopped working. We want to show that God is still there and he's still present. Without going into detail, there are some commentaries, I believe the Abarbanel, one of the major commentaries in the early 1500s or late 1400s, early 1500s, suggests that when we celebrate Shabbos, we're celebrating God creating nature. And what nature is God is there, but his hand is hidden. It's almost like he created a factory, made sure there's electricity going through the factory, and on Friday, right before Shabbos, turns on the switch, and then it goes. So therefore, the factory is working, the machinery is going because God powered it. God is the power behind it, and he's there also watching over it and making sure that things go smoothly. So what we're celebrating is not just God's cessation of work, but God's hidden presence in the world. The fact that God created nature and the fact that God is always looking over nature. We call that hashgacha, providence. There's hashgacha pratis and there's hashgacha klalis. There's divine providence on an individual level and there's divine providence on a communal or a universal level. Be that as it may, perhaps we're celebrating the fact that God is still present and that God is still running the world, and that there's providence in the world, that God is still there. And how best to celebrate that, or how best to remind us of that fact, but with Yetzias Mitzrayim, with the Exodus from Egypt. Where do we see that God is still involved in the working of the world, that God performed all these great miracles for us in Egypt to make sure that we're able to leave Egypt? Now you could ask, that's not work God within nature, that might be God beyond nature, and that calls for a long discussion. But simply speaking, it's showing that even though God created the world, he didn't just leave it. As they say, God is not dead. God is still present. God is still there. And when necessary, he intervenes. And when not necessary, he's still looking over. He's still seeing. He's still mashgiach min hachalanos, as it says in another place. He's looking from that window up in heaven. He knows what we're doing, and therefore we're still responsible for everything that we do. And therefore, that idea is particular to the Jewish people in the sense that we experienced God's divine providence very directly when he took us out of Egypt, when he formed us as a nation. And therefore, we are also obligated specifically to keep the Shabbos. In other words, the universal idea of remembering Shabbos, that's for everybody. Everybody has to know that God created the world in 6 days and he's there. But the celebration of that fact in the way that we actually perform the commandment of keeping the Shabbos every week, week in and week out, is more specifically to the Jewish people, because we are the ones who experience that divine providence, and we're the ones who understand it. And that's how the Ten Commandments starts out, as I like to always say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. It doesn't say, this is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari says, it does not say, I am the Lord your God who created the world. I am the Lord your God, Asher Hasesicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of the land of Egypt. Because the fact that God took us out of the land of Egypt proves that there's a God who created the world. Because otherwise, how do we know God is no longer, maybe he's no longer present. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he created the world and then went on vacation. But we see that God's continued presence. And therefore, the meaning of Shabbos is really that we understand God's continued presence in the world, in our life. Good Shabbos.